Dountas. Good day, this is Jack Friedman. I'm very proud to have as our guest today Ambassador Dountas, who is the Greek ambassador to the United Nations. He was also in the 1970s the Greek ambassador to Cyprus, the very misfortunate island in recent years, which has been the source of very controversial discussions between Greece, Turkey, the United States, Great Britain, and other countries who are very concerned about peace in the Eastern Mediterranean. I'd like to begin simply with a very brief recap of Cyprus history. The island was ruled by the Turks for several hundred years, and then by Great Britain. And in recent years, recent decades, it became independent. And in 1974, the Greek junta made an effort to unify Cyprus with Greece. And in 1974, the Turkish army invaded the northern part, separating the country into two areas. And this has been a very tragic development, creating a lot of controversy between several countries. In any case, Ambassador, I'd like to ask you, first of all, why is it that Americans should have an interest in Cyprus?
Well, Mr. Friedman, thank you very much in the first place for giving me the opportunity to talk with you. I think that on both counts, the United States should have an interest with regard to the Cyprus question, for reasons of principle and for reasons of political realities. I'll start with principle. In Cyprus, we have the case of an independent state, member of the United Nations, who suffered brutal invasion in 1974 by the Turkish army, powerful in comparison to the very small possibilities of Cyprus. Turkey is a close ally to the United States. Turkey is armed to a great extent by the United States. And so I'm sure the United States, whose people are genuinely devoted to principles of freedom and democracy, they're champions of principles of freedom and democracy. I'm positive that the United States people should have a great interest that this brutal illegality against Cyprus cease. It's something which is closely related to the very lofty principles cherished by the people of the United States.
Yes, when you were living there as the ambassador, could you give us an idea of some of the things you saw on a daily level, apart from matters of state and negotiations and so forth? But how did the crisis after 74?
Well, I will attempt to reply your question, but allow me to complete my first reply. I said that because of reasons of principle, the United States should be interested, and also because of political realities. What I mean by saying political realities is that in this Cyprus problem, there are wider interests which are involved, like the relations between Greece and Turkey, and like the stability in the area of the Middle East, which is already overburned by tensions. So that's why I believe that the United States should show an interest. Now, as to my personal experiences, were very sad. I went as ambassador of Greece to Cyprus immediately after the Turkish invasion and a few days after the fall of dictatorship in Greece. It's very difficult to recollect at this moment and to recite all my experience, of course, but I will focus on one which had impressed me deeply at the time, was the great dignity of the Greek Cypriots against this tragedy. I mean, they bore their tragedy and their sufferings with a tremendous amount of dignity. I used to go to refugee camps, I mean, and you could see there just people living on the soil, I mean, and they were trying to organize the area of this soil so that they saved just a minimum of their human dignity. Their expression of sorrow, of pain, was with measure, with dignity. That was the phenomenon which impressed me most deeply at that moment, emotionally and from the human point of view.
My understanding is that about 80% of the population of Cyprus is Greek, and 18% or so is Turkish.
Your understanding is correct, and this is an undisputed number, has been never disputed even by the Turks. The 80% of the population belong to the Greek culture, to the Greek ethnic background. I mean, they have the Greek ethnic background, but they are citizens of the independent state of Cyprus.
And when Turkey took over the northern third of the island, all of the Greeks had to leave that area, so that in essence, so what it is that the refugee problem is that over 100,000, whatever the number is, people from the northern third of the island,
close to 200,000.
Close to 200,000.
But
are now living in the south and do not have...
The number in absolute terms doesn't give the real dimension of the tragedy, because 200,000 constitute the 40% of the Greek population. It's like, for instance, in the United States, you have to displace 120 million people, I mean.
Right. And so they don't have access to their farms or businesses
or
schools. They just have been physically moved to another part.
An iron curtain.
And the troops divided. And then my understanding is that the people in the north, that the Turkish community, have announced that they want to have an independent country in the north.
Yes. But if you take into account, I mean, the geographical and economical realities, it's a small island. How can you have two states in an island of 600,000 people? I mean, and even the United Nations, before the invasion and before the compulsory movement of population, the United Nations, in the person of Gallo Plaza, the famous representative of the Secretary General in Cyprus during the crisis of 1964, had decided that, I mean, federations were practical there, because the population was intermingled. I mean, you didn't have a Turkish area and a Greek area. Now, of course, after the invasion, they have created this artificial partition.
Let me ask, the Turks would say that the Turkish government would say, well, we simply responded to a threat, and ours was a defensive move. Could you give me an idea of your view as
I'll try to be very brief, because actually you could write a great number of books on the subject, but the idea is, in the first place, that there is no excuse for any state to invade another state with the pretext of the protection of a minority.
Why is
you
that?
remember what happened in Czechoslovakia just before the Second World War. I mean, the Germans actually invaded Czechoslovakia for the protection of the Sudeten minority there.
So there's minorities everywhere in the world, and
there are many other means of protection. I mean,
if the ancestral home of the people had a right to intervene wherever they're...
you can have the dislocation of most of the states of the world of our days. I mean.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, of course, I recognize fully the legitimate right of a minority to feel secure. But you have so many other ways to do it. I mean, just I mentioned as an example, I mean, the idea which has been presented by the Prime Minister of Greece and by President Kyprianou of Cyprus, that if there was a genuine feeling of insecurity among the Turks, and I doubt there's a genuine one, but anyway, for the sake of the argument, I accept there is a genuine feeling of insecurity. You could have sent United Nations force there as a buffer to give them this feeling of security. You don't need to invade a state and to subjugate the majority of the people to all the sufferings which result from military invasion to protect the 18% of the minority against, to a great extent, imaginary threats.
I've heard some experts and some Greeks making the following points, which you might like to comment on. First of all, they said that the junta fell immediately in '74 upon the invasion by the Turks, and that a democratic government was immediately installed, and it would, if the Turks really simply wanted to prevent unification with Greece and abuse of their people with the new government, it could very quickly and easily have been arranged. That's one argument. In other words, the army of Turkey was not dealing with military dictatorship in Greece after a month, so the new government could have created peace. The second, let me
yes, I'm sorry.
and then the other argument was that for several hundred years Turkey ruled, the Ottoman Empire ruled Cyprus, and that the argument is that really the Turks want all of Cyprus if they could have it, which under current events they can't really do it, but they would have loved to include it. It's 40 miles off their border and so on and so forth, and that this was a pretext to reclaiming part of the island, but it was something they wanted to do anyhow and needed an excuse to be able to do it. It's not as if they did it reluctantly and only under great duress. So those are two arguments that I've heard Greeks make.
Mr. Friedman, you stated my argument more eloquently than I could have stated. That's my answer.
I do research for the program, so in any case.
I think that I can't add anything or detract anything from what you said, very eloquently.
Well, you have mentioned the UN coming in, could have come in. There is an extreme, to underline the word extreme, disillusionment in the United States with the United Nations. The philosophy people have now is that whichever majority gets the most financial aid or whatever it is the one that will scream, and now the Americans get criticized, and if the UN peacekeeping force is there, as soon as it gets hot, they jump away and leave, and they don't want to be shot at and so forth. My question is, what has the United Nations done, either in terms of troops or mediation or anything in the last years, to try to help the situation?
Mr. Friedman, you are touching upon a very delicate matter, which can be translated in a different question. What is the usefulness of the United Nations?
Well, this is a good case example.
Yes. My reply is that, of course, there are a lot of frustrations around the United Nations, and it's only natural, because the most obvious soft point, weak point of the United Nations is that its resolutions cannot be implemented. Mm-hmm. So you hear a lot of good rhetoric in the United Nations. A great number of good resolutions are voted upon, and you cannot have them implemented. But the very fact that the United Nations cannot live up to the standards of the dreams of the humanity, does not mean that the United Nations are useless. In the first place, they provide a forum for discussion of international matters. So there is a sort of a channel towards public opinion, international public opinion. The matters are aired there, they are discussed, and international public opinion takes perhaps a different view on certain international matters than the one that it takes from the domestic or national point of view.
There was just negotiations on the Cyprus issue within the last few months, and you might give us a little summary of those events.
No, I'm afraid that I can't.
Well,
so
just through the newspaper. I don't even
I'll
mean
tell
private.
you why. Because in the first place, this is a matter which falls completely within the jurisdiction of the government of Cyprus. And the government of Cyprus, the sovereign government of Cyprus, is holding and conducting the negotiations. So it's not for me to comment. The only thing I could say is that the Greek government genuinely supports the efforts of the Secretary General towards finding a durable and just solution to the Cyprus problem. If the Secretary General succeeds or not, this depends, in my view, to the greatest extent on the Turkish side, and particularly on Ankara, because when we're speaking about Turkish Cypriots, we're actually speaking about Ankara. I mean, Ankara dominates the area, Ankara occupies the area, the Turkish military, the Turkish army is there, so it's, I mean, illusionary and misleading to talk about Turkish Cypriots as a political force at this stage internationally. It's Ankara. So it depends immensely on Ankara's disposition with regard to the problem, if and whether Beguia is going to succeed in his efforts.
Well, Turkey has had a military government for a number of years now. Turkey has very serious economic problems. The question that some people ask is whether these the problems that and it borders on Russia itself. It's the only, I think it's the only NATO country that actually physically borders Russia, not one of Russia's allies.
It's only Norway, also Norway.
Norway at the very north. Okay. In any case, the question is whether those practical realities would keep Turkey from make them more accommodating in the future, or whether people fear that the more problems the country has, the more a government will tend to have foreign excitement in order to create diversions by the population. I mean, you hear this in the press all the time.
That's a theory, of course, that usually governments, particularly military governments who have internal problems, they try to channelize them towards outside the country, I mean. But with regard to Turkey, of course, they used to have for years a military government. Even now, I think that you can say that democracy functions regularly, at least according to the conventional Western standards. Mm-hmm. But I don't want you to draw the conclusion or to get the impression from what I'm saying that Greece has a hostility against Turkey. That would have been an absolutely inaccurate conclusion, erroneous conclusion. Greece is a small country, has no other option than to be peace-loving. We can't afford the luxury of being warmongers. We are very small, very weak as a country, militarily and economically. So even from the point of view of cynical considerations, we have no other option but to be peace-loving, you know.
Let us say that even if one would say cynically that there are dark forces in every people
yes.
that would like to have adventures abroad, the practical realities of Greece are such that no matter who would like to do something, they know that they have to be peaceful.
Exactly.
Okay.
And our only efforts, I mean, in the military field are purely defensive, purely. And I do stress this, purely defensive. We genuinely feel threatened by Turkey, genuinely. We feel that Turkey threatens the Aegean Islands.
Between near off
yes,
the Turkish
yes,
coast, which are
between in the close sea area between Turkey and Greece. And secondly, the already occupied Cyprus, which is not part of Greece, of course, it's an independent state, but which is inhabited by a great number, by a great majority, by people belonging to the Greek ethnical culture. So we genuinely feel that we're threatened, and I could have mentioned a great number of statements and other indications and evidence to substantiate my contention. And I wanted to tell you this. If you go to Greece, you know, Greeks are very much politically minded. They differ on every matter. If you have 3 Greeks, it's impossible to have 2 opinions. You're going to have 3 opinions. There's no doubt about this. But there is only one subject on which you will find a tremendous unanimity, that every Greek, no matter if he's a communist, a conservative, progressive, socialist, or whatever you call it, feels genuinely threatened by the great bulk of Turkey.
which is about 4 times larger.
4 times larger than, I mean, the Turkish army is 4 times larger than Greece's. And that's a genuine fear which determines our foreign policy.
Well, one of the fallouts I understand from the Cyprus crisis is that the Greeks were very disillusioned with America's not intervening to, with its good offices in Turkey to ask Turkey to compromise on the issue, either to prevent the invasion from happening or after the fact using diplomatic means to try to get some concessions. So I'm told by many people that right across the political spectrum, it's not a leftist, anti-American sort of feeling, but even conservatives in Greece are very disillusioned by whether America in the last 10 years has not done enough on the issue, not been friendly enough to Greece on this particular issue, has tended to tilt toward Turkey. Is that basically one of the fallouts?
You are correct
everybody
in describing the psychology of the people, but I would like to say that you feel frustrated in cases where before you had been enchanted, because otherwise you don't have frustration. I mean, the Greek people love the American people, traditionally. Even from the very beginning of the creation of the Greek state, there was a very close affinity between the American people and the American Philhellenes, who helped immensely the Greek struggle for independence during the 19th century. So, I mean, we have a genuine feeling of affection for the Americans. We are linked with the American people with the same principles. I mean, we cherish the same ideals about democracy, about freedom, justice, the rights of the individual, the freedom of spirit of expression.
You actually have a certain, having experienced dictatorship of your own military dictatorship by Turkey, etc., in a sense, the Greeks have a more keen sense of what a dictatorship is than Americans who only see it in other places.
Absolutely. But I wanted to tell you that what they call as anti-Americanism, and allow me to stress this point, because it has become very fashionable nowadays, both in the press and in TV and in, in more private circles, to talk, I mean, a bit frivolously, allow me to say, about the Greek anti-Americanism. That's erroneous. It's an oversweeping statement which does not reflect the reality. The Greek people are dissatisfied with the policies of given American administrations. And they are dissatisfied because they believe that the given American administrations are attaching great importance to Turkey, which threatens Greece. So by reflection to the attitudes of the United States government to Turkey, you have our feelings against the American government. But you shouldn't confuse a criticism, a frustration, a bitterness against the government,
or even a rhetorical flourish.
Yes,
right.
Rhetorical flourish, whatever you call it, with the feelings of a people with another people. And in Greece, there is a deep recognition, almost gratitude, I should say, for the stand or stance of the United States Congress in cases like Cyprus or like the military aid to Turkey and so on. Because Congress reflects more directly, I mean, the feeling of the people.
You mean efforts at embargoing arms
Yes,
to Turkey in Congress?
So, though you can see criticism for the government, you see praise for the Congress.
Well, what's interesting, the problem Americans have is that we like to be friends with everybody, so to speak. And the problem, like in the Falklands War is another example, is we have to choose between Britain and Argentina. And why should we choose between Britain and Argentina? It's actually their war in a limited sense. But because of the necessity and debts that have been created virtually over the centuries, we have to somehow take a stance, and we've tended to favor Britain. And so I think the problem that we have is this is another example of where America would like to be an ally of Turkey and an ally of Greece and not have to take sides. But because we have to hold an alliance together, namely NATO, common market, help with all of those things, we're forced to get into the situation where two friends, at least from a foreign policy point of view, two friends can actually both be antagonized. And I think the Turks' attitude is that they're mad at us too. So the State Department says, Isn't it great we're able to antagonize our friends equally? We must be doing something right.
Allow me to comment on that. That with all respect, it sounds to me a bit simplistic, a bit like the theme of a musical in Broadway, where everything is good and everything ends well, you know.
Right.
You are a global, you are a country, state with global interest and global influence. I mean, the United States has no other option than to choose and to choose. We choose in life, we choose every day. To try not to choose is an illusion, is an escapism from reality. And finally, what we do is we choose in favor of the strong and not in favor of the weak, under the pretext of neutrality. Because, allow me to complete this thought, particularly in the case of Cyprus, we believe that there was a breach of fundamental principles, not only of the United Nations Charter, but also principles cherished deeply by the American people, principles on which their everyday life is based. And we believe that these principles had been violated and breached there. And this is the belief of the Congress also. That's why the Congress has implemented embargo. So how can we expect us not to be frustrated that this great power is choosing not on the basis of principles but on the basis of expediency, because Turkey has a stronger army and commands a more important geopolitical position?
We have less than a minute left. I would like to give you an opportunity to make whatever closing
Thank you very
remarks
much.
you'd
I'll
like
tell
to.
you two statements. First of all, I'm grateful that you gave me this opportunity to address your audience. And in the second place, that Greece is not hostile to Turkey. We want peace with Turkey. But on the other hand, we are not ready to sacrifice anything for this peace.
Let me thank you very much. I'm very privileged to have you here today, and I thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Friedman. Thank you very much.
You just stay and relax.
Thank you.